This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello and welcome to the 42nd edition of the Photographing the West podcast, brought to you by Flanagan Photos. I'm your host, Kirby Flanagan. Today's guest is Ray Hennessy, self-described as a wedding and portrait photographer with a wildlife photography hobby. Calling what he does a hobby is a bit modest on his part, as he has a blog, a YouTube channel, and a website. And he's an avid bird photographer. I've invited him to be here today because he has a lot to teach bird photographers everywhere, I believe. And so welcome to Photographing the West, Ray. So Ray, tell everyone about yourself, your photography business, and your nature photography.
Yes, so I'm a wedding photographer for a living. My wife and I own our business. We have been doing it for just about 10 years now. And, weddings are our main thing, but we also do some portraits and some families and kind of whatever else comes along. And that's kind of how we make our living. And on the side, I've been doing wildlife photography as a hobby for about 12 years. I've been shooting wildlife, and I'd say the last 5 or so are when I really developed my style and kind of started working a little bit more to make somewhat of a living with wildlife photography. I am far from that, but just kind of trading out a little bit of weddings and adding in a little bit more wildlife as time goes on. And, I really don't have a specific end goal with income from wildlife photography right now. I'm still just enjoying it as a hobby and just making a little bit of money. And I really enjoy teaching, so that's been a big part of how I've been making some income with the wildlife photography.
Yeah, I've noticed that about you, that you really do like to teach. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on. One of the things I enjoy about your blog and your videos is your willingness to share your photographic journey, your failures, and your less than perfect shots, as well as those perfect shots that everybody shows. So tell me about how that fits into everything that you do.
Yeah, so I actually noticed, a long time ago, especially when I was new to the game, that in wildlife photography specifically, when you kind of follow some of these amazing photographers' feeds and their social media, you just see photo after photo that's just amazing and jaw-dropping, and it kind of can be a little intimidating to think, how on earth could you ever get from where you are currently as a beginner to that level? And I think it can be a little bit misleading, not on purpose, not that any photographer purposefully misleads anyone, but it can just be misleading to think that that's all they take are great photos. So, now that I've gotten to a level where I can share really good, clean photos every single day, I thought it was really helpful to share with the audience I've built up that not every photo I take is that way. The vast majority of them are close or completely no good, or, just complete misses sometimes. And, it's all about kind of picking out the good from the bad, and that's what you share most of the time. So I think seeing a little bit into the other side of it, and that, all photographers, even people that are doing it at a much higher level, are still making some of those, same mistakes, and not everything is perfect.
Very true. I certainly find that to be my own experience, and it does get a little easier as life goes on. But if you don't do it for a little while, then it's a whole new learning curve when you go out to shoot. So.
Yeah, I think you definitely, over time, and the more experience you get, you increase your odds of getting great photos and being able to share them and being more consistent. I've certainly become way more consistent over the years than I was, 10 years ago with wildlife. But that doesn't mean that all I take are great photos. I come back from a shoot. I just came back from one yesterday and took almost 2,000 photos, and I've currently narrowed that down to about 150, and I'll probably share 5 of those from that outing. So it's definitely not every photo gets shared kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I was looking at that video on your site, and I noticed that you tend to shoot a lot, and everybody
Yep.
has their own approach to that. And I guess I shoot less now than I used to, but I still shoot a lot as well. So
Sure.
it's a matter of what works for you as much as anything else, I think.
Very much so. And then I think part of the reason I tend to shoot a little bit more than maybe some others is the style and the settings that I'm shooting. I shoot a 500 millimeter f4 and I shoot it almost exclusively wide open. So, the depth of field is very narrow window. And I do that because I like the end result of the photo, how it looks, but that means that I miss focus all the time. So I could have the wing of the bird in focus, but the eye could be out, or I could have the tip of the beak in focus and the eye could be out. So, shooting a lot helps me guarantee or increase my odds that one of those photos in that set is going to be tack sharp right on the eye, right where I want it.
Sure. Yeah, I shoot with a 600 a lot of the time, and same issue,
Okay.
of course.
Yep. Yeah.
So you're known for your subject small in the frame style. How did that style develop, and how do you approach making that type of shot?
Yeah, it's been great. One of the best compliments I get lately has been when someone comments and says that they recognize one of my photos as mine before they even saw my name, and I think that's just an incredible compliment, and something I've been working on a while to kind of work towards that style, like you said, of smaller in the frame. And interestingly enough, that came in my wildlife photography. It came about as a crossover for my wedding photography. Obviously with wedding photography, even though weddings can probably be chaotic and seem very chaotic to most, especially if you've never photographed them, as a portrait photographer, you have a lot more control than you do with wildlife. You can control the subject most of the time and ask them to do things and position people in certain places and control the background and the lighting a little bit more. So having more control over those aspects of taking a photo allowed me to experiment a lot more and certainly learn from my wife and feed off some of the things she was experimenting with and trying. And over time with our wedding photography, that became somewhat of a style of ours that we like to shoot. And that was, having people smaller in the frame and having some of the nice scenery or some of the really nice venue that these wedding couples have chosen to have their wedding at, and featuring that in the image instead of simply a portrait of the couple. So that eventually started crossing over into my wildlife photography, and I started realizing that I was enjoying creating images where, I mainly photograph birds. So where the bird was smaller in the frame, it included more habitat, and hopefully the goal was it told a little bit more of a story of the photo of that bird than just simply, here's a close-up detailed photo of this bird. I think many people, especially in the beginning, I know for myself, the goal was always just get closer, get closer, get closer, because we were all no good in the beginning at getting close to wildlife, especially birds. And, once I was able to achieve that goal pretty consistently and I was able to constantly get close to birds, I realized I needed to do something a little bit more with it, and that kind of became the style. And the challenges I actually find it a little bit more challenging than doing just a close-up photo, because now you're including a lot more content in the image. So it's not just about a bird with a really blown out soft focus background. It's about the bird and everything else in the frame, the other branches and leaves and the background and the foreground that are included. And they all have to kind of work together to make a nice photo, but still make the bird somehow be the subject and stand out in that photo. And that's a challenge I really love to work towards with that style of photography.
Yeah, I would think that would be a major challenge. I'm still at the close-up stage, I guess, but I really appreciate your style, and it's certainly very different from most of what's out there. So how do you go about setting up a shot in order to achieve that type of a setting?
Yeah, it really depends on the subject, obviously. I spend right now, the last month or two, I've been spending a lot of time. I live in southern New Jersey, and I spend a lot of time on the beaches here. It's kind of shorebird season in this area. So, beach setting is usually just kind of a wide open, flat, sandy beach. Maybe there's some marsh grass in the background or a little hill or a dune or something like that. But it's just kind of a wide open canvas. So creating space and interest in that can be a little bit easier because it's easy to isolate the subject, but how is it's thinking about it. So how is the photo more than just here's a tiny bird in a big wide open space? So it's interesting compositions, heavy offsets, maybe really strong backlight, which is something that I absolutely love to use. I've been working hard with backlight for the last, I'd say, 3 years. So trying to find some dramatic lighting or something else interesting with a real heavy offset composition can make a shorebird stand out in basically a blank wide open canvas. Other seasons, it just came off of the spring with warbler season, and that's a lot of time spent mostly in forest and dealing with leaves getting in the way and branches, and that's another circumstance where shooting that high volume of photos really comes into play, because these birds are bouncing all over the place, and sometimes it's not so much composing in camera as it is just trying to get the bird sharp and somewhat facing you, and then composing in post with a crop after the fact, which I'm certainly not opposed to do. So it really depends on the subject and the approach. But mainly I am not always just trying to get closer. So it's a conscious decision of, all right, here's my target in front of me. And instead of instinctively moving closer that I used to do for countless years, I kind of stay put and look around and find something that might be an interesting scene and hope it heads that way, or try to position myself in a spot that I can intercept the bird when it maybe gets in one of those good areas. One of the things I tell a lot of people I teach, the biggest thing you can do to help yourself get more creative with your photography, and I think this is all aspects of photography, whether it be wildlife or weddings, portraits, no matter what you do, is to stop just acting and slow down and consciously think about what you're doing. So take a minute to actually consciously think of how you want to create this photo, and as soon as that happens, it starts changing how you approach photography, especially with wildlife.
Yeah, that's great advice. Going back to the warblers for a minute, you've got some great warbler shots, which
Thank you.
certainly aren't easy at the best of times, let alone trying to do an environmental shot.
Yeah, they're a lot of fun. I had a friend who recently introduced me, I say recently, I guess 2 years ago, introduced me to kind of really going after that type of bird, whereas previously I hadn't really put much effort into them. And I'm not sure, Kirby, if you've ever really tried to photograph them much, but they are one incredible challenge, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, I used to live in Northeast Ohio, and so, yeah, I have some experience in trying to shoot warblers, not any really good experiences, but
Gotcha.
Made the effort anyway.
So I'm very lucky in the area I live. Most people, when you say New Jersey, they don't think wildlife, and they especially don't think birds and warblers. But I think, and I'm not positive on this, but I think ballpark about 25-ish, maybe a little bit more or a little bit less species of warbler breed in New Jersey.
Oh, wow.
And finding breeding warbler habitat is definitely the key to photographing them. So in the previous years before I really made a concerted effort to photograph warblers, I always knew about them, and all I ever knew was they moved through my area during migration. Well, trying to photograph migrating warblers is, it's not the easiest thing. They're all about trying to, fuel up and move on. So they are very much never in the same area. They're just constantly moving through. Many species tend to just stay high in the canopy, so you're always just looking up at them, which isn't the most flattering angle. And once I connected with my friend, and he started suggesting I approach warblers a little bit differently, and that was finding breeding habitat for them. That really is what changed the game for me. So that was the first aspect of doing some good warbler photography, was realizing and researching that they breed in the area. So once I learned that, it was doing a lot of research online, on the off season, to find out what specific species breed in what areas, what kind of habitat they like, and then thinking back to all the different places I had been previously and trying to find that habitat. So that's pretty much my approach with warbler photography. So this past spring, I did a ton of research and made kind of a wish list of warblers I wanted to get. Found out their different habitats, made a couple list of places that I thought might be good for photography for them. I heavily use eBird as a research tool for that. So if you're not familiar with the eBird website, I definitely would recommend checking that out. But that's a great way to find out where specific species have been reported. So, and it's also a great tool to find out what time of the year might be best to find higher numbers of them. And then the third aspect of warbler photography is learning their calls. So I find probably 90% of the warblers that I photograph by sound first before I ever even see them. And that's definitely an important part of it. And then when they're breeding in a certain area, they tend to hang out in the same area for quite some time. So these aren't migrating birds that have just gone through. These are birds that have set up on a territory and they're defending it. So they're calling, especially in the morning. So you can kind of zero in on them and they generally hang in the same area. And if you spend enough time there, they generally start to move around and many of them come down. There are a few species that I've used minimal call playback on, but it's not a common practice and it doesn't necessarily need it to be used for all of them. But that's kind of my approach with warbler photography.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, my exposure was definitely with migrating birds, and
yeah,
as you say, they're high in the canopy. They move around a lot. You're lucky if they'll sit still for more than a few seconds at a time. So it's yeah, definitely a challenge.
And it's still sort of the case, even with the birds on territory. It's not like they sit there for 5 minutes on a single perch, although it does happen occasionally, but that's not a common occurrence. So they're still bouncing around all the time, constantly feeding and that sort of thing, but they're at least in one particular area for a while. And, I've spent sometimes, I spent probably about 2 hours straight in waders up to 3 feet deep in swamp water in this one particular area photographing a prothonotary warbler this past season. And, that bird was in the area singing nonstop for almost 2 hours straight, just kind of bouncing around, moving. I watched him pick up dragonfly after dragonfly, and then he'd come and land on a log near me, and then he would fly away a little bit and then come back again. And it was his habitat, so he was constantly in that area, and I just put the time in and you get the photos.
Yeah. So how do you approach things when you're out there wading through the swamps, keeping yourself dry and keeping your gear dry?
So I'm also well known for, kind of doing what it takes to get the photo. I have no problem getting myself wet, dirty, muddy, into all kinds of stuff. Lately, I've been doing a lot of more photography in the marshes of New Jersey and the Back Bay areas and the mud. So I get in a wetsuit and get in the water, tripod and all. But for example, the prothonotary warbler, that was just my Nikon D4S on the Nikon 500 millimeter and a monopod. I use a monopod. Probably 90% of my photography is done on a monopod, especially for warblers. I just like the freedom of movement so much more. There's so many times where a warbler will land in a great spot, but there's one little tiny branch right in between you and that bird, and a move, about 5 inches to the right is all you need. And if I was stuck on a tripod, that would be a cumbersome thing to pick it up and move it and make sure it sets down in the right spot again. Whereas a monopod, I can just kind of lean over and get the shot in a split second. So that's a very important tool for me. And it's just part of the style I like to shoot. But I know many people that shoot from tripods only because that's kind of what they like, a little more stable platform. So yeah, monopod in the water. I had just heavy waders on and lots of bug spray because it was filled with mosquitoes. That was not fun.
No doubt.
And yeah, I just kind of walked through the swamp and found, I found perches that looked like they would be great and they were open and in good light. And I found a spot that had multiple of them around. So I could kind of position myself in one spot, and if he would come down in this one particular area, I could shoot that way, or if he'd come down in another area, I could just kind of turn myself around and shoot in another area. And that was another great thing where having the monopod was just easy to kind of pick it right up out of the water, turn myself around and plunk it back down, and I was ready to shoot. Whereas a tripod would be a lot more cumbersome in the water where I couldn't see what I was setting it in, and it might be really off level and all those sort of things. And yeah, that was all the equipment I had, just the waders, the monopod, and the camera gear. That was it.
Yeah, I've tried using monopods myself and never found them to be very stable in my hands, at least. So you have
Mhm.
some certain technique you use or special kind of gear that you use?
Not really. So for my monopod, an important addition to the monopod is a good head for it. So my one friend Scott, who I shoot with a lot, and we both shoot warblers together, he uses a gimbal head on his monopod. And I just use a small little monopod head, which is simply just a tilt head. It has no rotation. It just tilts up and down because all the rotation just happens with the monopod itself. And as far as techniques with shooting with it, just practice. It was a lot of practice and just kind of getting used to it. I've taken photos on that monopod down to 100th of a second. And thankfully the lenses have really good stabilizers in them. That's definitely an important part of it as well. But the majority of my warbler photography, since it's done in the forest and the canopies, and I really prefer to shoot them in overcast light versus sunlight, just because there's a lot less shadows and harsh light bouncing around in the forest. So it's a lot of low light situations. So the majority of my warbler photos are taken between 250th of a second to 320th of a second. So generally speaking, slower shutter speeds, and it's all done from the monopod. So I think just with some practice with it and some good stabilization on the lens, it can definitely be done.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. I guess I'll have to try a little harder with that. So we've
Yeah,
talked.
I really love the flexibility that the monopod gives. As you know, you've seen warblers move. They're quick little things, and they don't give you very much time to kind of set up and think about the shot. So being able to react quick is definitely a plus.
Yeah, for sure. So we've talked a little bit about gear, but why don't you go ahead and explain what all types of gear you use and why you use those?
Yeah, sure thing. So my main camera body is a Nikon D4S, and I originally bought that for wedding work, and it's just an amazing camera to do weddings and wildlife, and it's probably a little bit overkill for the weddings, but since I didn't want to buy a wildlife camera and a wedding camera, I just kind of got the one that would work the best for both. And the one thing I love about that camera body the most is its low light capability. So for example, there was a photo of a cerulean warbler I shared this year, and I think I had the shutter speed around 100, 125th of a second, and the ISO was at 16,000. And with a little bit of post-processing, noise reduction, I didn't do anything crazy on it. I was able to get a nice, clean, usable image out of it. So, having that capability of shooting a lot of low light scenarios and getting cleaner, usable images out of that sensor is definitely a plus for my style of photography. So having that camera being able to do that is definitely a bonus. The lens I shoot probably 95% of the time for wildlife is the Nikon 500mm f4. It's not their most recent version. It's the previous version that does have the stabilization in it. And it's a tank of a lens. I absolutely love it. It's heavy, but I drag that thing with me everywhere. When I'm teaching and I do want to go, or if another scenario, I just want to go really lightweight and I'm just out scouting, I do have a Nikon 300 f4. It's their PF version, which is the really, really small lightweight version. And I'll pair that up with a 1.4 teleconverter and take that out with me. And that's a thing I can just kind of throw on a sling and just go anywhere and shoot with. And I'm getting 420mm on a full frame, which isn't a ton of reach, but it's generally enough to get something if I do come across it. And other than that, let's see, those are the main things. Oh, for the shorebird stuff and all my low angle shorebirds and waterfowl and stuff like that, I also use a ground pod, which is basically like an upside down Frisbee, and you just mount a pan tilt head to it. And that allows me to have a stable panning surface while staying really low to the ground, which is definitely a part of my style of shooting with anything on the water or ground level. And I will use a right angle viewfinder attachment for those as well, since I'm laying prone for sometimes many hours. Bending down and cranking your neck to look through that viewfinder can be a little painful and cumbersome over long periods of time. So the right angle viewfinder is kind of a must for me for saving my neck and just allowing me to shoot those uncomfortable positions for a little bit longer.
Yeah, for sure. I was curious how you like that 300 PF. I've got a 300 2.8, which I really
Nice.
like, but it's
Yeah.
also very heavy.
Yep. Yeah. That PF lens is incredible. So I really am not a fan of the teleconverter, the 1.4 teleconverter paired with my 500 millimeter. I've seen it paired with Nikon's latest 500 millimeter, and it looks amazing. But that previous generation, for whatever reason, just I lose a lot of focus accuracy with it. So um, when I hit focus, it's nice and sharp, but there's just way too much that I miss focus with it. So I almost never use that. I'm almost always shooting that 500 just straight, which is usually plenty for me because, as we talked about earlier, I kind of leave more space in the frame, so I don't necessarily need to get as close as many other people might want to. But with that 300 f4 with the teleconverter, in my opinion, from my use of it, it's just as sharp as my 500 without the teleconverter.
Really?
And yeah, it's just has blown my mind how good that lens is, and the stabilization on it is some of the best I've ever seen from any of the Nikon lenses I've shot. So you can really, I lose a stop of light with the teleconverter, so it becomes a 5.6 lens with the minimum aperture. But even losing that stop of light compared to the f4 lens, I just drop the shutter speed a little bit because the stabilization is just so darn good in that lens. And it's fast enough autofocus to track birds in flight. I have no problem doing that, and it's just incredible. I've been in love with that lens.
Wow, sounds like.
Yeah, yeah. But that being said, I'll still always take the reach and the extra f-stop, and I take the 500 out more than that. So,
Yeah.
that's still my go-to lens.
Do you use flash at all?
I do not actually. So I'm pretty experienced with flash from my wedding photography. I do a lot of off-camera flash with that and multiple off-camera flashes sometimes. So it's not that I don't know flash well or haven't wanted to mess with it. I do feel like I know it pretty well. I've just never been a fan of it for my style of wildlife photography. I have a few friends that, especially for warblers, they use it, and they use it really well too, I might add. So I've definitely seen some great flash fill wildlife photography. But for me, it's just mainly the main reason is just one more thing to think about and worry about. I already have enough stuff trying to figure out the composition, get a clean view, make sure the thing's in focus, make sure the exposure's right. So adding a flash into the mix just sounds like way too much for me.
Yeah, I used to use flash when I was back in Ohio, but with newer, higher ISO cameras, it seems like you really don't need it as much as you used to.
I would very much agree with you on that. And then I think if you work a little bit harder on paying attention to the available light, then you can sometimes, and not always, but you can sometimes kind of counteract any, disadvantage you may have from using just available light. And sometimes you can even make it more of an advantage. Instead of maybe relying on that flash to give you the fill light, just maybe it's changing an angle or finding a position under an overhang or any number of circumstances that kind of create some more directional light and allowing you to get some flattering light on the bird. But I think it can be a good tool when used properly. I just think the key is to not go overboard with it. I think when it looks flash, that's when it's maybe too much.
Right, for sure. So you mentioned photographing in New Jersey where you live. Any other favorite spots?
Yeah, I usually spend a month or two in Florida in the winter. I have some family that lives down there, so understandably, the wedding business in New Jersey in the winter, in January and February, isn't too booming. So we have a bit of a downtime. And since my wife and I own our own business, we can kind of control our schedule. So we go down there for a while. So this year we'll be going down for 2 months. And I spend a lot of time doing some photography in Florida. So I would say, area-wise, that's probably my second favorite area to shoot, mainly because that's kind of the only other area I shoot. I unfortunately haven't traveled too much in this country, and it's definitely something I want to start working on and branching out to travel a little bit more.
Any special spots in Florida that you enjoy?
Yeah, there was a spot on the West Coast I visited 2 years ago. So there's a very famous wildlife refuge down there called Ding Darling. It's on Sanibel Island, and while I think it's an amazing place for birding, the 3 times I've visited it have never been great for photography. So I've always seen a ton of stuff, but being as though it's a national wildlife refuge, you have to respect their rules, understandably. So there's not a lot of freedom for movement, which means you kind of have to stay on their dirt roads, and it's a drive-through refuge. So you stay on their roads, and there's a lot of people around. So I've not found a lot of freedom of movement to kind of create the compositions or get in position to get the right background or foreground or lighting. And I've kind of never had a great experience with bird photography there, even though I've seen a ton of great birds. But not too far from there in Fort Myers is a place called Bunch Beach. And that is just kind of a wide open flats area. And on mid tide to low tide, the water level is low enough that tons of shorebirds and wading birds come in there to feed in these flats. And it goes out really far. You can walk up to your knee, probably, 200 yards offshore, and the water doesn't get any deeper. So it's just this wide open space and lots of variety of shorebirds there. And I'd say I had probably one of my best Florida bird photography days down there at that one particular spot, which is really nice. And then on the East Coast, where I stay I spend more of my time on the East Coast. There's always Merritt Island, which is really good and very well known. But then south of that, there's a couple of places. There's one called Vieira Wetlands, which is pretty well known, and it's just a water treatment facility that they have allowed, access for the public to come in and photograph all the birds that take advantage of the clean water that's set up there and, controlled in all these different ponds. And then further south of there is another place called Vero Wetlands, which is in Vero Beach, Florida. And it's pretty much the same as Vieira Wetlands, except it's way less popular. So I found a lot less people there, and just pretty much the same experiences as Vieira Wetlands. So that in more recent years has become another favorite spot of mine.
Yeah, I had a similar experience going to Ding Darling. I've only been there once, but
Okay.
yeah, trying to shoot from your vehicle was a real challenge, and I didn't get anything I was real happy with. So I'm glad to know
Yeah,
about these other spots.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear that from someone else's perspective, because I feel like anytime anybody asks about locations to photograph in Florida, that's kind of like one of the go-to places that's mentioned over and over again, and I just have never really understood why. So it's comforting to know you had a kind of a similar experience as I did, in that it may not be the best place for photography.
So when you're going to these various places, do you shoot from your car or do you use a blind? How do you approach that?
I very rarely shoot from my car. Um, it's just my personality, and part of my enjoyment of wildlife photography, bird photography, is just getting out there. So there's definitely certain circumstances where actually using your car as a blind is an advantage. And when that is the case and it's the best option, I'll totally do that. But I prefer much more to just kind of get out and move around and be walking and exploring on my own by foot. So that's usually more of my approach. For warbler photography and almost all my shorebird photography, I don't do any blinds. Those birds generally don't seem to have too much of an issue coming in close, as long as you're not moving and jumping around and being real active, just kind of sitting stationary in one spot. I've had shorebirds almost walk right over top of me as I've been laying in one spot on the beach. They just kind of, I think they assume you're a log after a certain point and just walk right by, which is nice. But I do some blind photography. I've had a local kingfisher, and then for all my waterfowl photography, I do use a blind for that. And I usually just use just a cloth camo throw blind that I just toss over me. It can work whether I'm sitting up and using a tripod, or it can work if I'm laying down prone or even sitting in the water. For waterfowl, I can just kind of drape it over me and let the majority of it just kind of float in the water there. And that thing has worked really good. It's made by the company Lens Coat, and it has an opening for the lens, so you can kind of cinch it right around your lens, and then a nice camo screen that you can look through to see out of. So that's been a great blind that I do love using for wildlife photography.
So when you're out in the water or even on the beach, do you wear like chest waders, or how do you do that?
In the summer, when it's warm enough down here and the water's all warm enough, then I'm either, for the shorebirds, I'm just kind of laying in some shallow water. I just kind of wear the normal clothing I'm wearing, which is just thin, long pants and thin, long sleeve shirt. I never wear shorts and a t-shirt because I'm always crawling around on the beach and that sand will tear your skin up. So I do always wear long clothing, and unfortunately it can be hot sometimes, but at least my skin thanks me later. So I don't really worry about waders or anything doing that kind of photography. When I'm in the marshes and I'm looking for, recently I've been photographing some rails and some other marsh species that hang out in kind of the tidal marshes around New Jersey. And it's warm enough there, but when sitting in one spot for a long time, it kind of cools you off. And that I usually just wear a thin wetsuit for. And then when the water temperatures start dropping during the winter seasons and that sort of thing, I definitely just put on, I have really heavy, thick chest waders that I would use for that. So that's the kind of go-to for the winter stuff.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, moving on, you obviously like to teach. Why don't you talk about your YouTube site and your approach to teaching?
Yeah, sure thing. So with teaching, I've always just really enjoyed sharing the knowledge that I've kind of acquired, and been lucky enough to have a few people tell me I'm good at teaching. So I've taken that and kind of gone with it. So the YouTube channel came about from my friend Scott Keys and I just wanting to find an easy way to share some of this knowledge and get some of that information out there. And he has a blog as well as I do, and we both have realized over time that writing a thoughtful, well put together blog post is a very time consuming process. You kind of have to really think about the topic and write it out and then proofread it and add all the images. And like some average blog post can take me anywhere from 3 to 5 hours of work on the back end, actually creating them and making sure everything's just right before I actually click that publish button. And while those are great, we wanted a little bit more of a simple way to get things out there. And we realized that doing some of these live videos is just a much easier way. We can get a lot more information out talking, and we can also show a lot more things by showing our computer screen. So we actually started out by doing it all on Facebook Live because I built up a decent audience there. But I would always record the sessions that we were doing and share them on our YouTube channel. And starting with our next episode, we're going to be doing it actually live on YouTube. So we're going to open it up to the entire YouTube audience, and you won't have to have a Facebook account to follow along live. And then, of course, we'll post the recorded version as well for watching later. But we just realized that, we can sit down and talk for an hour and answer people's questions and share our photos and our screen and our editing techniques and anything else we want to talk about. And we can do all this in an hour. And then when we're done, it's done. So in an hour, we can actually get out a lot more information than you could ever kind of do in the same amount of time of working on a written blog post. And there's obviously also just different kinds of things you can do with, a live video and sharing our screen and being able to show photos and exactly how we edit them and show the photo while you're talking about it and point to things. And it's just a lot more interactive. And we started doing it live because we really wanted to have kind of a question and answer thing. Instead of us just talking at people that might be watching later down the road, we wanted to talk to the people that we're watching currently and have them be able to ask questions and answer those questions and have some interaction there. And that's been really fun.
Yeah, I enjoy that part of it as well. So glad to hear that's going well for you. So what hardware and software do you use for your YouTube videos?
Yeah, so on a Mac, I have a 27-inch iMac, and I used the OBS software, which is a free to download software. It's open source, and it's been working really great. So it allows me to share my screen, and then I connect with Skype to my friend Scott, and he can share his screen through Skype, and I can then share his screen with the live session as well. So I can kind of flip back and forth between his screen and my screen, and we can even do a split screen with it. And you know, we've had no issues. It's been working out great, and you certainly can't beat the price for free with that, which has been really nice. But it's definitely been a learning curve, and you know, I know we were talking a little bit before we started the session here, Kirby, about how there's almost always something that comes up, and we're still trying to figure it out. And I've had things kind of fall apart right in the middle of the session where I drop the connection with Scott, or lose his screen, or the audio gets off, or something happens. But you know, thankfully the audience has been kind to us and has kind of just followed us through the fumbles of figuring it all out. And you know, since we're currently not doing it for any monetary gain or anything like that right now, it's just trying to build up an audience and have some fun and share some of this information with the community we love. Yeah, I think people are kind of a little bit more forgiving in that regard.
That's good. So you're happy with the OBS software? That seems to be the standard, I guess.
Yeah, it does seem to be. And you know, like I said, since we just wanted to kind of start playing around with it and seeing what it was, we didn't want to invest in, you know, any really expensive software at this point. So, you know, starting out with something free, and it's been working really great. And in the testing that we have done, we noticed making the switch from streaming live from Facebook to YouTube, the quality increase we should get is going to be very dramatic. So, you know, we know in the live stream on Facebook, especially trying to see any details on the screen and read text, it's not great quality. So it's been nice doing it on Facebook because the built-in audience is there, but this YouTube stream that we're going to do next looks like the quality is going to be 10 times better and much clearer to see and follow along, which should hopefully be a good thing. So we just kind of have to hope our audience joins us there.
So, and that's using the same type of software and hardware?
Same exact software. Yep. Yeah, I didn't change a thing. It's just, I guess, you know, I really don't know a lot about the back end of this, but I'm guessing it's just the quality of whatever connection it has to YouTube through the built-in OBS software, the streaming. I don't know if it's just the resolution that it tends to stream at or how it works, but we did a test about a week ago, and it was just a marked difference in the quality.
So where can people find your YouTube channel?
Yeah, so the YouTube channel is called Wildlife Inspired, and it's just youtube.com/wildlifeinspired. And our next live show is coming up next Wednesday, August 8th. So if you visit youtube.com/wildlifeinspired/live, you can see all the details about that next upcoming show right there.
Okay. So yeah. You mentioned being a blogger. Are you still doing blogging since you're doing the video, or is that fallen by the wayside?
Yes. No, not at all. I still definitely like writing, and you know, the advantage of a written blog post is I can really take my time with it, and I feel like I can tackle a little bit more complicated topics, I should say, with a written blog post than I can with an audio blog post, because I can kind of really pick my words and make sure my point is getting across the way I want, and not kind of fumble through saying it and maybe saying something the wrong way and having it taken the wrong way. So I definitely like the written blog posts for that reason. And lately I've been kind of mixing up my written blog posts with a combination of just sharing collections of photos from outings that I've done. You know, I tend to share a new photo every single day, but I only share one photo a day. And doing that method, I can't really share all the photos that I've accumulated from past outings because there's usually more than just one from a particular outing that I'd like to share. So I have these sets of images that sit on my hard drive and in my Lightroom catalog, and I still want to share them with the community. So doing a blog post that just shares, here's a collection of photos that I shot on this particular outing, is a great way for me to do that. So those are one type of blog post I do. And then I mix in some more kind of what I like to call opinion pieces. So it's just my thoughts on a particular topic. And I've actually been getting really great feedback from those kind of opinion pieces. You know, people really like seeing the just pretty photos, and that's always nice to look at. But the other day I did an entire post on how important is a technically perfect wildlife photo. And the main concept there was, once you get to a certain point with wildlife photography, you start to realize that if the photo isn't technically perfect and perfectly text sharp, or maybe the exposure was off when you took it, but the end result of that photo is it has a great emotional impact to the viewer, then maybe you can start to let some of those technical things slide. and having just a nice to look at or a photo that has an impact to the viewer can sometimes outweigh slight technical imperfections. Obviously the photo can't be a complete out of focus, blurry, horribly exposed mess, but sometimes I have a bunch of great photos, and there's a bunch of examples in this post where, when you look at the high resolution photo, I kind of missed focus a little bit, or my exposure was 2 stops off because I made a mistake when I took it, but I was able to recover it and get it close enough, and the photo was worth sharing in the end. So that was a topic I wrote about and got a lot of great feedback from, and those sort of things have been a lot of fun to kind of think about and write about and hear people's thoughts back.
Yeah, I actually read that blog post and thought it was very interesting and thought-provoking, so thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to read that.
So you also put some videos in your blogs, and of course you're doing the YouTube channel. Are you what hardware are you using for the video that you put in your blogs?
So the video that goes in the blogs that is from the YouTube channel is just the same, or from our live shows, that's just the same recorded software through OBS. But as far as the wildlife videos that I've shot and put together, that's all using the same exact stuff that I shoot for still. So it's the Nikon D4S with the 500 f4. And the only time, though, I love to shoot video a lot more often, but here's the one downside of a monopod. You can't shoot video with a monopod.
Right.
No matter how still I try to hold it, it just waves all over the place, and it would make you seasick to watch it. So all the times that I am out photographing things with my monopod, I really can't ever just kind of switch over and grab some video. So the only time I can do video is when I'm sitting in a blind with my tripod set up, or a lot of my waterfowl or shorebird photography is done from that ground pod that sits right on the ground, and that's basically as stable as a tripod, so I'm able to actually do video with that. So I'm limited with what I can shoot, but I do shoot some video, and I have a whole collection of that sitting on a hard drive that every once in a while when I have some free time, I pop open Adobe Premiere, pull some clips in, and see if I can edit together something that's worth sharing. And sometimes it's a whole series of clips that I try to put together into a small story, or sometimes it's just a simple short clip of a nice looking bird in nice light doing something interesting.
Yeah. I've started doing a bit of video also, and yeah, you're right. You have to have something pretty stable. So I actually got a video tripod and with a fluid head and all that good stuff.
Nice.
So, yeah,
it's on my wish list, Kirby. That's something I really want to play with a lot more because I've really found it fun to do. But I just don't have, like you said, you really have to have the equipment that you just mentioned to do it properly.
Yeah, and it is a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed the little bit of it I've done. I can't say I enjoyed the post-processing very much.
I second that.
Premiere Pro is not what you'd call user-friendly in my book, at least.
Yep.
But I'm struggling my way through it. So.
Same here.
So it's like I say, it's a lot of fun. So that makes it worthwhile.
Yeah, and there's one other really interesting thing I found with video. For my camera, anyway, the Nikon D4S allows you to shoot a 2.7 time crop factor on the sensor and still pull out a full 1080p video. So what that means is my 500 millimeter now becomes, let me do the quick calculation right here. It now becomes the equivalent of a 1350 millimeter, and it still shoots full HD video. So there's many times where, even though I like subjects small in the frame, they still may just be too far away for me to do any good still photography with. So I'll actually switch over to video, and I can punch in, to the equivalent of a 1300 millimeter lens, or I think it's almost an 1800 millimeter equivalent if I have my teleconverter in, and still get full HD video. And that's something I've been doing a ton of. So, especially with waterfowl, I'm waiting for the birds to come in close. They're hanging on the opposite side of the pond. It's just way too far for me to get stills of. I'll just switch over to video, crop in like crazy, and I'm still getting full 1080p video out of it, and it looks crystal clear like I'm sitting right next to them.
Cool. Yeah, I haven't really tried that. I started reading about it and started talking about, needing follow focus and all this other stuff to be able to do it
Yeah.
well. So
Yep.
I ended up actually getting a Canon XA35 video camera, and
Okay.
it zooms in pretty tight also, and
Nice.
there's an add-on lens that you can get for it that really gives you some reach. So that's been fun to use, and sounds like less work. The autofocus at least on the Canon video cameras is pretty good, so you don't have to worry so much about that as you do when shooting a DSLR, or so I've read anyway.
Yeah, it's pretty much all manual focus for me, so that is a horrible thing. And I don't do enough video. I don't have an external monitor to look at either, so I'm just looking at the back of my tiny LCD. And if it's bright sun out, it's really hard to focus. So, it's definitely something that I only play with in certain circumstances, and I definitely don't have the setup to really kind of move forward with it. But it's something I'll keep playing with and keep working more towards. So.
Yeah, I quickly learned that I needed an external monitor, and that's a lifesaver.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I think that would make a big difference. So that might be my next investment. We'll see.
Okay. Well, it's been great talking to you. Tell everybody where they can find your work and your blog, your videos, and all the other stuff you do.
Sure thing. The easiest thing you can do is just hit rayhennessy.com. So it's RayHennessy.com. And I have links to all the different places I share. So I share on social media every day on Facebook, Flickr, Instagram, 500px. And so you can find me on any of those places. And then my website is crushedboxphoto.com. And that is also a place where you can just kind of connect with me everywhere, but that's where I share my blogs. All my teaching stuff is on there. I have workshops I offer. I have online workshops for Lightroom and Photoshop and all kinds of stuff on there. So there's a lot of free content, and there's also some paid content on there too, to kind of take the learning a little bit further if you're interested. But those are the main places you can find me, and all my social media contacts are on there as well.
Great. Well, thanks again for being on the show, Ray. It's been fun.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. I really appreciate you having me here, Kirby.
Sure. You can find more information about Ray and some of his photos in the show notes. This podcast is published on the 15th and 30th of each month on iTunes, on my website at www.flanaganphotos, spelled Photos.com, and most RSS feeds. So thanks for listening, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.